Hi, and thanks for joining. I'm so excited you're here. This is the first ever RevDesk Nano training. This is the start of a series where we're really excited about bringing bite-sized trainings to dive into deep and complex topics, particularly related to revenue recognition. We're starting here with an overview of ASC 606 because you have to start somewhere, and we want to make sure everyone has the same foundation when we're working through this material. So with that, we're going to jump right in, and we're going to start with scoping, which is an important place to start for any technical topic in the accounting world. So with that, ASC 606 is considered residual guidance. What does that mean, you might ask? Great question. It means that if there is any other guidance that applies, you must apply that guidance first in the hierarchy before you go into ASC 606. Where I have seen that come into play with some of my clients is with the leasing guidance. You might have a lease, for example, of hardware that you sell software on or with, and that could come into play. Another place is with collaborative arrangements in a case where there might be co-development going on, and that could be another area, particularly for biotech companies. Other guidance could include financial services, insurance, financial instruments, guarantees, non-monetary exchanges, and not-for-profit entities. And just to make things a little more fun, or complex, depending on your perspective, you may have a situation where you have multiple units of accounting and some belong in one guidance and others belong in another guidance. For example, you could have a lease of hardware, but you could also be selling services or software with that hardware in the same transaction, and you'd actually have to bifurcate that transaction to be accounted for under the two different sets of guidance. Sounds like fun, right? Well, with that, let's dive into the actual guidance itself. So what does fall within 606? Any transactions with customers for goods or services that are an output of the entity's ordinary activities. What does that mean, ordinary? Well, I'll give you an example. Let's say you're a biotech company and you sell some office furniture that you're no longer using. You're not in the business of selling office furniture. You're in the business of doing research and development, providing biotech services or medical devices. And so when you go to sell that furniture, that is not considered part of your ordinary activities. In contrast, there could be a showroom down the street that sells used office furniture. And if they sell that same exact office furniture for the same exact price, that would be considered their ordinary activities, and it would be within the scope of ASC 606. So the idea here is if you normally sell it, it's what you're in business to do, and you're doing it in exchange for consideration with customers, you're within the scope of ASC 606. Now with that, let's dive into it a little bit deeper. Within ASC 606, we have a 5-step revenue model. The first step is to identify the contract with customer. The second step, identify the performance obligations in the contract. Third step, determine the transaction price. Fourth step, allocate the transaction price to the performance obligations in the contract. Step 5, recognize revenue when or as the entity satisfies a performance obligation. Sounds simple, right? Well, looks can be deceiving, of course. As you dive into each of these steps, you'll find that there's a lot of complexity there hiding in the details. With that, let's just do a quick overview of each step so you can start to get an idea of the complexities involved. Step 1, identify the contract. This is all about what are your enforceable rights and obligations. There are specific criteria in the guidance on what makes up a contract. So the contract must be approved. The entity's rights and related to the goods or services must be identified in the contract. You must also have payment terms stipulated. And I think most importantly, there must be commercial substance. So if you sign a contract to do something for free, let's say it's a free trial period, there's no commercial substance there. So you don't have a contract by definition within ASC 606. And then lastly, there's the probability that you will collect substantially all of the consideration in the contract. Collectability is often a much talked about topic because this is a departure from the old 605 guidance. Within step 1, there's other complex topics that come up, such as contract combinations and termination clauses, which will impact what you include in your contract. With that, let's move on to step 2, identifying the performance obligations. So identifying the performance obligations, this is where you are thinking about what are you providing to your customers. Sounds easy, right? Well, sometimes it's not. For example, are you providing a software license or are you providing software as a service? Sometimes the lines there can be a little fuzzy. If you're selling a license of IP to a customer, is that license of IP functional or symbolic? They have different revenue ramifications when you get into some of the later steps, so it matters. And then finally, multiple performance obligations versus a single combined performance obligation. Now, the guidance talks a lot about how to determine what a performance obligation is, and it talks about this idea of distinct. Is a promise to a customer capable of being distinct? That's the first question. And then the second question is, assuming it is capable of being distinct, is it distinct within this contract with the customer? This specific contract. So for example, if I sell prefab homes, where one of my customers purchases a home and 3 to 4 months later we deliver the home on a truck, and that home was built with lots of different materials, but one of the materials included a kitchen sink. Now I could buy that same sink at Home Depot down the street. When I buy it from Home Depot, it's a distinct performance obligation, right? I'm buying a single tangible good. It is certainly capable of being distinct. But when I buy that sink as part of a prefab home, it's not distinct within the contract because I'm buying a home. I'm not buying all the individual pieces that went into building that home. So that's an example of something that is capable of being distinct, but not necessarily distinct within the context of the contract. With that, let's move on to step 3. Step 3 is where you determine what your transaction price is. That sounds like that, isn't it? Written in the contract? And while that may seem like an obvious answer, and sometimes that is the obvious answer, it could be right there in the contract and be very straightforward. Often that is not the case. Often we might see something that could introduce variable consideration. For example, a history of concessions, contingent payments. One I see quite often is usage-based fees. Another one that could present a change to the transaction price is a significant financing component and consideration payable to a customer. All of these are concepts that can add complexity when determining what the transaction price. Once you have the transaction price, you're ready for step 4. Step 4 is where you allocate that transaction price that you determined in step 3, and then you allocate it to the performance obligations that you identified as part of step 2. Sometimes no allocation is needed. For example, if you sell just one performance obligation, you don't need to allocate that transaction price. If I go down to Home Depot and I buy a sink for $100, that's the transaction price, and it's allocated all to that sink. Another example where you might not need to allocate is if you have multiple performance obligations where all of those performance obligations have the same contract term. So for example, if I'm a SaaS company and I have 3 different SaaS subscription offerings, each of them distinct from the other, a customer could purchase all 3 with the same start and end date. They all roll up to the same financial reporting line. No one cares how much is allocated to one subscription line or the other, unless you want it for managerial purposes. But in those cases, you may not have to allocate. Now, if you're in the last bucket, which is multiple performance obligations, different contract terms, you must allocate, then you need to first start by determining your SSP or your standalone selling price. Again, sometimes this is straightforward. Other times it can be quite complex. Once you have that though, and we'll dive into that another day, but once you have your standalone selling price, you would use that SSP to allocate the transaction price proportionately to the performance obligations using the relative selling price method. Again, a story for another day. But that's what you do in step 4 is take that transaction price and allocate it amongst your performance obligations. And now, finally, we get to step 5. Step 5 is where we actually get to recognize revenue. Now, when we go to recognize revenue, we think about control and how the transfer of control goes from the entity to the end user or the customer. Sometimes, again, this can be very straightforward. I go down to Home Depot, I put it in my trunk, I drive away with it, control has been transferred. Either way, you need to figure out how that transfer happens and when it happens so that you can recognize revenue accordingly. So, as you can see, each of the steps may be simple at first glance, but as we get into them a little bit more, you can see there's a lot of nuance. And often the road is not a straight one. We can dive back and forth and go from one step to the other, and then back again from 1 to 3 to 5 to 2 to 4. It's not always linear, but that's all part of the fun. And don't worry, we're here to do it with you. We'll dive into each step and find more nuance and complexity as we go in bite-sized little pieces. We hope to have you join us in trainings and that you can participate in the fun along the way. Thank you so much for joining, and we hope to have you back.